All right. Thank you, Amanda. Like Amanda said, I'm Connie Strunk. I work as plant pathology field specialist down in Sioux Falls, and I'll be talking today a little bit about some plant diseases, kind of some to watch for, some that we're predicting may occur this summer, and a little bit about how disease works, some hail with fungicide application, and then just really, is a fungicide a profitable expense? So want to just give credit to Dr. Emmanuel Bayamkama, who is our state extension plant pathologist, in providing a lot of the research information for today's presentation. All right, when we talk about plant diseases, the biggest thing is plant diseases, just like anything, are often confused with the numerous things out there within the environment. Oftentimes before we recommend a fungicide or making any type of control, we need to get that problem identified. Because the issue is plant diseases can be confused with nutrient deficiency. They can have different issues with water logging in the soils, different salt toxicities, drought. We heard a little bit about drought coming up, soil compaction, herbicide toxicity, other diseases, and even some nematodes. So again, there's a lot of lookalikes out there. One of the things that I really want to impress by the end of today's presentation is just really the importance of scouting before doing any application out in the field and getting things properly identified, whether that's by taking pictures, taking samples, taking that little bit of time is well worth the investment, especially because fungicides are not a cure-all for every disease or issue out there. So again, really want you to do scouting to get things properly identified out in the field. So as we kind of move in, let's talk a little bit about some of the diseases that we've seen in the state or speculate that we will be seeing this year. The first disease is bacterial leaf streak of corn. It was first reported in Nebraska in 2016. We didn't find it until 2019 in South Dakota. We now have it in 4 different counties, such as Lake, Brule, Sanborn, Turner. So quite, sporadic as to where corn is being grown. It is found in other neighboring states. So it is out there within that environment. The bacterial leaf streak of corn is caused by Xanthomonas, and I won't go into the rest of the detail there. It does overwinter as a bacteria in infested crop debris or crop residue. So it does overwinter. How this disease spreads is that bacteria then enters the corn leaves through natural openings or wounds on the plant. So some of those wounds could be caused by hail, but that bacteria needs a means of entry to enter into that corn plant. For this disease is really favored by high humidity, so moisture in the air. If we see continuous corn, it just puts the residues out there with the perfect environment to be able to infect that next crop. And then minimum tillage, again, anything that leaves a lot of those residues there has a higher opportunity for the bacterial diseases to take hold. Now, so bacterial leaf streak is one of our newer diseases in corn that we're seeing in the state of South Dakota. What it looks like, or some of the symptoms, if you will, often it'll start as a narrow, long, light brown streak kind of down the leaf of the corn. It'll start to expand over time and it becomes long brown streaks. And this is the key. It's got some wavy margins. These streaks often will appear yellow when they are backlit. So if you'd hold them up against the sun, or if you put a light behind it, you'll kind of see a backlit yellow streak within there. This disease appears to be more systemic and does not appear to cause that plant death. So it does not appear to be systemic or really cause plant death. We haven't seen much of a yield loss to this disease, so that's a great thing. But we're always having to watch for that over time, because we used to say that about, oh man, it escapes me. Bacterial disease in corn. It'll come to me here in a second. Anyhow, with bacterial leaf streak, again, we don't see this one as being a huge yield limiter, where Goss's wilt, the other bacterial disease, can have quite devastating effects on our yield. And that is a bacterial disease that started out not having much problems in the state, and then we really adapted the last number of years to kind of being an epidemic out in the field, if you will. And that's where with bacterial diseases, really taking a look at some of those hybrids for management of that disease kind of really helps us to get ahead or stay ahead of that disease. This picture here just kind of shows the progression of bacterial leaf streak. Notice on the left of the screen, the long, narrow in the middle, we're getting to see more of that infection, a little bit longer, kind of expanding, where then you look at the picture of the corn leaf on the right, where it's really expanded, really taking over on that leaf surface, having that bacterial infection. So it can be quite devastating to look at out in the field. Again, so far we've not seen much of a yield loss or yield hit to bacterial leaf streak in corn. The problem with this disease is that the gray leaf spot looks a lot like bacterial leaf streak. Our bacterial leaf streak here on the right side is that bacterial disease. We have a wavy margin, whereas gray leaf spot on the left is more of an angled, or what I call like a really sharp rectangular type, bound within the margins of those leaf cells and walls, whereas the bacterial leaf streak will take over that leaf surface. So again, really want to take a look to distinguish between the two, because we've got bacterial leaf streak where we cannot apply any in-season control. We have gray leaf spot that we can apply a fungicide for. Now, if we just apply a fungicide, not knowing what disease it is, if it is a bacterial leaf streak, you're just wasting your money because it's not controlling that bacterial leaf streak disease. If it's gray leaf spot, as you see on the left, that fungicide would control that disease. So again, they look alike. Under magnification and really taking a look at them, you can see the differences between the two diseases. You can see some of that bacterial exudate with the bacterial leaf streak, whereas you're not going to find that with gray leaf spot. So my quick moral of the story is this: if you think you have gray leaf spot, it's worth getting it checked out. Again, take pictures, take samples, get that sent in, because it'll really help protect your pocketbook at the end of the day if it ends up being that bacterial disease. And then again, also, if we just randomly apply those fungicides, we could be looking at some fungicide resistance developing, and we want to be able to have fungicides in our toolbox, if you will, so that way we can control these diseases when they happen. So again, our fungal disease gray leaf spot can be controlled by a fungicide, whereas bacterial leaf streak cannot, since it is that bacterial disease. So a little bit, again, looking at that management for bacterial leaf streak. Right now, we've not seen a huge hit to yield. So we're speculating that hopefully it stays the same like that, but impact on yield really depends on the extent and time of infection. Are you in that continuous corn operation? Have you had issues with that in the past? Do you have a lot of, volunteer corn? Because it resides on those corn residues. So that next season, it just needs a wound or that means of entry to get into the plant to cause that bacterial infection. So we want to look at crop rotation, looking at tillage or residue management if you are in that operation that would set yourself up for positive infection rates, if you will. As of right now, there is no resistance in hybrids, but I like to say yet. That could change over time. So just be on the watch for it. Again, the biggest thing is get it properly scouted so that way you know what you're working with and you're not having to spend unneeded money for fungicide if it is not a fungal disease. These are a quick look at some of the common fungal diseases in corn. We have northern corn leaf blight. That's kind of longer, elongated, almost looks like a dirty cigar, if you will. They can start out fairly small, but then they really coalesce and elongate quite severely into quite sizable shapes. Again, the shape difference between that and gray leaf spot is quite sizable. Gray leaf spot is the second one here from the left side of the screen. That gray leaf spot, they start out pretty small. You can have a lot of spots within or on the leaf. They can get a little bit bigger, but the fungal diseases tend to stay confined within the cell of, like the plant cell or the within the midrib. They stay confined within their area. Our common rust is typically a disease that we see in every South Dakota cornfields, especially if we have a little bit of cooler or a little bit of moisture early in that planting season. We tend to see a lot of common rust out in the field. We have not needed to apply a lot of fungicides for that. Again, we always want to watch, making sure that if you do have quite a significant infection, if it came in early, but usually once the weather changes, once it gets hot, we tend to not have a problem with common rust. Like it tends to kind of stop and put a little checkpoint or check gate out there. But we do see it is very common here in the state. The other disease is eye spot. Again, you're going to see these little specks, it's going to have a halo around it, especially if you put it up into the sunlight. You will really see those halos really shine brightly, if you will. Those are the major fungal diseases in corn that we would typically apply fungicide for to control. There is another rust. Now, northern corn leaf blight, gray leaf spot, eye spot, they're residue borne, they're here, they're kind of always within our environment, if you will. Our rusts, they tend to blow in. They don't overwinter or stay here. So we always watch and scout and look for them. The other rust that we get, and is becoming more of an emerging problem within South Dakota, generally we get it late enough in the year, so like that late August or September timeframing. We usually get it after black layer, so it's not been a yield issue for us, is southern rust. It's a little bit different in makeup and size and shape and color than common rust, but I mean, still like a rust, you're still able to rub off or remove those, pustules within your fingers or your clothes if you're scouting through the field. But with southern rust, it can become yield limiting if we get it before that black layer. Like if we get it early enough in the growing season, then a fungicide application, especially if conditions are conducive and we're seeing that the disease is active, if you will, we would want to encourage a fungicide at that time. But most of our growing seasons, we've not had to worry about it. I really thought 2 years ago with all of the late planted corn that we had because of all the wet spring that we'd really see an issue, and we really didn't see much southern rust really affect the yield. So again, we're having to watch and wait for those rusts to blow up, what we call that Puccinia pathway, where they're blowing up from the south, really watching for them. And then it again is really taking a look at that environment and seeing, what's happening. And the most important thing when it comes for this disease is what growth stage we're at. Because again, if we're at that black layer and denting, we're not having to worry about yield loss being affected by southern rust because it's so minimal, the fungicide just wouldn't pay at that point in time. So when we talk a little bit about fungicide for our return on investment and the best timing, in corn, we're really looking at applying those fungicides for those foliar diseases, so that northern corn leaf blight, gray leaf spot, eye spot, at that VT to R1 timing. Your common rust really depends on your infection and, like I said, the weather at the time. But that VT to R1 timing is the best time for foliar applied fungicide for corn. Now, for late maturing, late planted corn, really encourage you to keep your eye on that, on the field for southern rust, because then, you may, and I use the word may very loosely, have to apply that fungicide. So again, that's the one that's tied more to that, if it's black layer, that sort of thing. So really kind of keeping scouting, watching for that don't just openly apply those fungicides. Kind of switching gears here real quick, looking at a pest known as soybean cyst management or soybean cyst nematode. We have it in all the soybean growing areas. As you see on the map here within the state, we're constantly finding, new counties and areas that it's at. Just because there's a spot on the map that hasn't been identified doesn't mean you're in the clear or it's not in that county. We just haven't processed a sample from that county or seen that field. Because the problem with SCN is a lot of times you're going to go up to a field and you're not going to see any symptoms out there, but you could have cyst and you could be having an up to a 30% yield loss. When you start to see symptoms, so the stunting, this yellowing, the roller coaster effect out in the field, you could have anywhere from a 30 to 70%, if not even more, yield loss occurring out in the field. So it's an unsegmented roundworm that attacks those roots. What you can do for SCN, we encourage sampling. For SCN, we have sample bags available. With the Soybean Research and Promotion Council, they offer soybean sampling free of testing for nematodes to South Dakota soybean growers. So we encourage you to get those samples and send them into the plant diagnostic clinic. Again, it doesn't cost you anything other than a little bit of your time. You can target sample, meaning the entryways into the field, the fence rows, lower lying areas, or if you have an area in your field that on your yield monitor you've just notoriously had lower yielding, that's where we would encourage you to target and get some of those samples sent in from. Once we start seeing a cyst or a positive egg count come back, it's time to make some management decisions and treatment options on that. Real quick, just want to show you the importance of when you're looking at making your soybean seed selection, really want you to consider selecting a resistant line for SCN, especially if you have SCN out in the field, because resistance alone has been seen to really help out there. And then especially if you couple that with some seed treatment, you can really reduce the number of cysts out in the field. So again, here at the bottom, statistically different, looking at applying those seed treatments to the resistant line. So really wanting to look at utilizing that resistance, because that's the one technology that you're not having to currently pay for that will help really reduce that load. We don't have all time to talk on that today, but certainly can visit with you more if you have questions on SCN. Just encourage you to sample that. Other diseases we've seen and speculate if the soils are cooler, wet on planting, we might see a lot of Phytophthora or some of the root rot diseases. Phytophthora is one that can affect the season throughout the entire growing season, from seeds going in, so it can attack the seeds, the seedlings, and it can take out plants throughout that entire growing season. Oftentimes, to know that you're going to have Phytophthora, you're going to see a chocolate brown lesion that's going to start at the soil line and move its way up the plant. That's one of our diagnostic tools that we look at when we just do a visual analysis for what's going wrong in the field. So again, there's different ways to kind of manage for Phytophthora. There's some different genes. In a study that SDSU did from 2018 to 2020, they went and sampled different fields and were able to pull out what different races of Phytophthora were found here in the state. And as you see, the highest races that they were finding were 1A, 1B, 1C, 1K, and they were finding a little bit of that 1D. So we're seeing a lot of that gene being overtaken by Phytophthora out in the field, where we have the lower ones are more in that category of the 3, 6, and really wanting to look at 8, and then the combination of those genes for your best protection. So I would try to steer away from any genes when you're making your selection that have that any of the 1 in there, wanting to look more towards the genes of 3, 6, 8, or a combination of any of the 2 of above. Other things, if you can improve the drainage in the field, and then seed treatments will really help to prevent that disease from taking over within the field. One of our foliar diseases that we can apply some fungicide for is Frogeye leaf spot. Again, it's kind of a circular to angled type lesion, dark brown, reddish margin. With time, that center kind of becomes an ashen gray and can fall out. The lesions may coalesce, leading to larger defoliation. With Frogeye, the big issue here is that we have to be careful because it does look a lot like herbicide injury. Not only that, but this is one of our foliar diseases that we have seen have some fungicide resistance to. So we really want to make sure that you are seeing Frogeye, because a lot of our diseases, they can look like something else. We want to make sure we're properly identifying that fungal disease. So that way, when we do put that fungicide on there, we're actually controlling the problem and not just putting it on there for something else that might be occurring. White mold is another disease that, if you've had it in the past, higher probability that you'll have it again. If you're up in like that Brown County area, you just have always been like a pretty good hotspot for that disease. So really encourage you to scout, look for things. When we talk about timing of fungicide, white mold is one that's got a limited window of treatment because it comes in during those reproductive phases. So that R1, our first flower, full flower, beginning pod, that's when white mold would infect, is during that flowering time frame. So we really want to get that fungicide on at that R1 stage of growth to get in right before those flowers, because we want to protect those flowers on that plant. So again, white mold, apply at that R1 beginning of flowering. There's different fungicides, but you can refer to our pest management guides for more of that information as to what would control white mold. Our other fungal diseases, we're looking at that timing of that R3, R4, so that beginning pod, full pod time. So that Frogeye leaf spot, that time frame would be more of that beginning pod, full pod time frame for best optimal control out there. We don't have a lot of diseases that need fungicide in soybeans. The other one is brown spot, but we don't tend to have a massive issue unless you're soybean on soybean in a no-till type environment and you've had a massive issue with brown spot, then you may need to consider a fungicide. But generally in South Dakota, we've not needed to apply a fungicide for brown spot. Kind of real quick, mentioning Fusarium head blight. This is a continual disease that we're always having to watch, monitor for. We do have some different tools, and I will drop those in the chat when I'm done, just to kind of help you plan for scab on whether you would need to control it or not. It is known as Fusarium head blight. It affects, again, during that reproductive time frame. So, kind of the thing to say with diseases is we really need to know when that infection takes place for the best optimal control. And again, to really scout to see what diseases are occurring out there. Again, Fusarium head blight, we want to apply our fungicide during that flowering time frame because we really want to protect against those DONs or those mycotoxins that develop with this disease. Some of the quick management tools or tips would be plant those resistant cultivars, rotate away from corn and small grains because the diseases go kind of back and forth within the two, and then plan that triazole fungicide again at that flowering time frame. Really, and it's based on weather. If it's hot and dry and we don't have moisture and we don't have the humidity and whatnot, we're typically not going to see much of a Fusarium head blight problem. If it's going to rain, if we have humidity, a lot of that moisture in the air, whether it's rain or if it's just that humidity, as perfect conditions for Fusarium head blight to develop. So again, real briefly, when we look at fungicide timing in wheat, an early fungicide for tillering is needed is if you're under a no-till arrangement, or if you're seeing stripe rust develop early. So again, tillering, that would be an early fungicide, recommended more so if you're under a no-till setup and if you're seeing stripe rust develop early. Flag leaf and headings, again, I'll put this climate tool underneath or in the chat for you to peruse, kind of gives you some tips and tricks to look for. And then same with the flowering for scab with our scab monitor forecasting tool. So those are quick for wheat. Another disease that we've seen progressive over the years is crown rust here in the state. It seems anymore with oats, we're having to apply a fungicide if we're wanting to take it for grain or if you really want that high good straw. So just really, again, some of the diseases, this picture just speaks magnitudes because shows the resistant cultivar Dion compared to a susceptible cultivar called Colt. Dion, is standing nicely, really full, lots of grain up there. When we look at that susceptible variety, really being overtaken by crown rust, stunted plants, not as good canopy fill, and just not seeing as much for yield. So again, really want to look at those resistance within the genetics available us to when we make our seed selection. With crown rust, just if you have buckthorn in the area, kind of scout through. If you're seeing buckthorn that has crown rust on the buckthorn because it's an alternative host type crop for this disease, then you want to scout your oat field. Once you're starting to see crown rust pustules on those lower leaves, a fungicide treatment is recommended. So you'd want to apply that early, typically at that flag leaf time frame, to when the flag is fully emerged for your best optimal control for crown rust on oats. When we talk about, fungal diseases, oops, Matt, could I have you quickly launch that poll? For those of you that are able, if you could just quickly answer this poll question: fungicides control all plant diseases, true or false? And it would just be a quick answer and then hit submit. It's a very anonymous poll, just trying to break up the monotony of us just talking to you here. When it looks like a good majority have, if you want to just close that poll and quickly share the answers with us. Good. Fungicides do not control all plant diseases. They only control those fungal diseases. So good. Either you guys are really smart and have paid attention over the years, or I'm doing an okay job today. Anyhow, when we talk about fungal pathogens, there are filamentous thread-like organisms that are always in the environment. They're spread by spores, mycelia, they can be on the seed. Some of these diseases, they're in the environment, but we say that they blow up here just because we're in the northern part of the United States. They don't overwinter here because we get too cold, or different, reasons as to why they don't overwinter here. So we watch and they blow up from the southern part of the United States. They can affect any part of the plant. Okay, come on. I don't know. The poll has not allowed me to continue on.
Connie, what's your problem? I closed the poll.
Okay. Well, I see my screen, but I can't advance. Oh, cool. There we go. There we go. Got it. Sorry about that. So again, fungal diseases and pathogens, they're always in our environment. Depending on what disease we have, we may have to have them blow up, such as the case is all of our rusts. And that's been pretty uniform within the wheat and our wheat and soybean rust that we have within the United States crop. Our crown rust is an exception because it overwinters on buckthorn. Anyhow, when we talk about plant disease management, really, you have to really kind of think about where that disease inoculum is coming from. And then, is it blowing in, or is it something that's overwintering or staying here? And then from there, the next question is, where are we finding that disease on the plant? So that kind of tied back to that growth stage. So again, as you kind of look at symptoms here on the plant, if you look at my wheat plant, picture if you don't grow wheat, picture any other crop that you grow. It's kind of the same principles here. As you see the red here, it's attacking the roots and those lower stems. Well, you're either going to have a root rot or you're going to have a residue-borne type disease. So that's kind of where it's coming from and how it's attacking, right? So when we say scout early, kind of watch for that tillarine, apply there. If it's nematodes, it's attacking underground. We have other fungal diseases that attack the roots, but depends on that growth stage as to when they will show up. As we kind of move through, again, those early leaves, that early tillarine, we have stuff that typically would fly in or windborne, blows in, touches those older higher leaves on the plant, same with the reproductive phases with the heading and such. So again, depending on crop stage of growth is going to determine when or how the disease is going to progress and the different treatment that would be needed. So again, real briefly, we call it the plant disease triangle. We need our hosts, so our susceptible plants. We need our pathogens, so that disease, whether it's blowing in or resides here. And then the big thing is that environment. Most of our diseases need some form of wetness, moisture, humidity to have that optimal temperature, that optimal growth conditions for that disease to happen. If you take away one of these things, generally, the disease opportunity is not there to develop. And this is looking at more of that, the fungal, those bacterial diseases. This doesn't really relate to the nematodes or some of the viruses. But anyhow, so that plant disease triangle is a huge thing that we need to really play and think about. Real briefly, when we talk about fungicide, return on a fungicide investment works with the yield. Yield as a result of fungicide application pays for the cost of the fungicide and the application and profit margin. So it's driven by the extent of the yield gain. So how many bushels do you need to get that fungicide to control? The price of the grain is a consideration. So like, are you going to get enough extra bushels out that it's going to, pay for it? When we talk about the pay for it part, it's like the cost of the fungicide and the application. Because sometimes, you can maybe ultimately yield with one extra bushel, but it does not pay. But anyhow, I am out of time, and disease is something that I could spend all day talking on, and I only had a few minutes today. So anyhow, just want to thank you for sticking with us. And if you have questions, please drop them in the chat or send me an email. So with that, I'll turn it back to Amanda.